Okay, well, welcome everybody who's on to join us this evening. Thanks so much for being here tonight. My name is Pam Bond. I'm on the board of the Idaho Trails Association. I'll be the moderator for the webinar tonight. Just a couple of housekeeping things. If you have questions, feel free to drop those in the Q&A or the chat at any time, and we'll just take some little breaks here and there and ask our presenters some questions. Just so you know about some upcoming events, our Backpacking 101 webinar series starts April 4th. And there's also a Backpacking 101, I think it's a clinic starting April 6th. There's also going to be a trail data collection webinar April 18th, where we're actually looking to recruit some volunteers to go into some focus areas and GPS trails that they're hiking to give us some more information. April 27th, we'll be having a Gear Up, a used gear sale here in Boise, Idaho. And then you can check out all of our other events. I would suggest going out to our Facebook page. You can find us at idahotrailsassociation.org as well. And tonight we have Phil Hough and Deb Hunsicker, and they're going to be talking about a hike they did through the Great Burn, which is a proposed wilderness area. And with that, I'm just going to let them take over.
Thank you, Pam. So I'm Phil Hough, and as Pam said, my wife Deb and I had the pleasure to take a hike through the Great Burn last summer, and would love to know maybe a show of hands somehow to Pam, who could then relay back to me how many folks on the webinar have been in the Great Burn, and for how many this is their first vision into the country. And then you can interrupt me, Pam, and let me know, and we'll kind of moderate things from there. For us, it was the first time. It had been a trip we had actually planned to do a year or two earlier, and then I managed to break a big toe, and so had to set the plans aside. But eventually they came to fruition, and we'll do a couple maps and a little bit of stats as we go through. My original vision was we would hike north from Lolo Pass, which is the northern end of the roadless area, the Hoodoo roadless area or the Great Burn roadless area, to its southern end, just north of Lolo Pass. Most of that would be 3/4 on trail and about 1/4 off trail. But as we progressed, and we'll talk about this through the slides, we ended up having to change plans. And what we eventually did was all of the Stateline Trail and a wonderful side trip into Kelly Creek. And that made for a fabulous journey, which could be easily replicated. So here we are midway, looking down the spine of mountains that forms the Idaho-Montana boundary, and really the pinnacle of the Great Burn. But that's not where we started. We started at the north end. If you go to the Great Burn Conservation Alliance's website, what you'll see is this map. The area that's in blue is the Great Burn Conservation Area. It's the general ecosystem that the Great Burn lies in. It's really at the heart of where the fires in 1910 burned through the Idaho-Montana border, not completely, in a mosaic. And it created this patchwork of habitats that persist even 100 years later as things regenerate at different paces. At the very heart of this larger area is this area that's in magenta or purple. It's a roadless area that sits on the west side of the divide. There's another roadless area that sits on the east side, and that's the area proposed for wilderness that the Great Burn Conservation Alliance, Idaho Conservation League, Montana Wilderness Association, and others are advocating for. But it does take an act of Congress, and if you'd like, at the end, we can go through questions regarding that process. For us, this was a trip just to explore the heart of the area, that wild country that teems on either side of the divide by getting up on it and looking down. So what we ended up actually hiking was about 55 miles over 6 days, 30 of it along the Stateline Trail, which we began with the Stateline Trail at Lolo Pass and headed south to its southern terminus at the Schley parking lot, Schley Divide. You could, in theory, go to where we started and then continue on north along the Stateline Trail for about another 200 miles. It's a wonderful trail, a national recreation trail, a great gem of backcountry that's just begging to be explored. Here's the trail through the Great Burn. The underlying base map is one that you can pick up from the Great Burn Conservation Association or ordered through them online. This is the divide here that separates, the high divide that separates the two states. And then it continues on south from here, but we exited out where the Stateline Trail exit out over Schley Saddle. Starting off in late August, we began on the Monday before Labor Day weekend. So late August when weather should be at its best. And we had hoped for that. And as you'll see as we go through, things that you hope for aren't always what happens. But the first day was a fabulous day, warm, dry, wonderful views. The trail along the ridgeline is defined by a topography that on its eastern aspect into Montana is very rugged and punctuated by cliffs and lake basins, this being one of them, Hidden Lake, the first one. Okay, there we go. And then continuing on to the saddle above Heart Lake, and you can see the trails that are very steep down to the lakes, but we stayed along the ridge line and looked down onto Heart Lake, one of the more popular destinations in the Great Burn, accessed by trails that are in lower elevation off of the trail up to Hough Pass most frequently. But it's a stunning gem, and we got to look down on it from above, which is a really unique perspective. From about the same spot Deb was looking down at Heart Lake, I'm peering off in the distance, if you can see the cursor here, at another lake, that's Pearl Lake. It takes a bit more effort to visit Pearl Lake. It drew me in. That's one of the things about this area. It made me want to go explore more. And I have some unfinished business to do there with Pearl Lake at some point in time. Continuing on around the escarpments on the south end, we look back north over Heart Lake. Again, get a good view. The main trail of Heart Lake comes up through this valley off of Hough Pass, and again is a very highly visited area. Probably 3/4, I'm making that statistic up, but I think anecdotally it's true, of the visitation to the Great Burn probably are day trips to the Heart Lake area. Just south of there, up on the ramparts, we saw our first mountain goats, one of the iconic animals of northern Idaho, northwestern Montana, found in somewhat abundance in the Great Burn area, as well as some of the other more also iconic destinations in our two states' northern extremes. Again, one of the amazing things was this relatively rolling, not too challenging Stateline Trail, lots of up and down, but gentle up and down, but punctuated almost continuously by these really steep cliffs on the one side. And then we'll see views over into Idaho on the other in a moment. For now, we continued on to look over Dalton Lake. As you can see from the shadows, it's getting later in the day. And on a personal level, Deb and I like to hike late in the day. You get that magic light. So we'll often push it until just before dark before we set up camp. Looking back north and slightly to the west, you can see some of the area that's into Idaho towards the Mallard-Larkins area. It looks like it's a little bit more gentle topography. It doesn't have those steep cliffs, but don't let that fool you. There are very convoluted basins and ranges in there, and one could quite easily get lost in there for days and days on end, as you can see from, again, this more directly aspect, western looking aspect. This is a part of Idaho that's really not very populated. These are large roadless area expanses, some of them proposed for wilderness like the Mallard-Larkins and the Great Burn, and some of them in other backcountry status, but certainly a wonderful part of our state. An area in which I will say as an aside, Idaho Trails Association does a lot of work to keep trails open and access open in those areas. So at the end of this webinar, if you haven't, you might consider going to the website and signing up for one of those trail projects to help keep access open. We're going to talk about that theme a little bit further on in the show too. This photo looks directly south along the divide. And this is going to be our future over the next several days, coming up and over this mountain and down and up these, and then over and down and up and down, and lots of up and down. Not as challenging perhaps as the steep cliff face itself more directly, but what was interesting was that what looked like a relatively smooth trail on the map, when you get to looking at those topo lines really carefully and getting out there, over the course of that 30 odd miles, we had several thousand feet of elevation gain loss every day. So it is a somewhat challenging trail in that regard. This is the upper of 3 lakes called the Trio of Lakes. And again, the lengthening shadows, you can see that we are true to form pushing dark, but nothing beats a good rest break at the end of the day. So Deb had gone as far as she was going to go for that moment. Anything you want to say here, dear, about your state of mind? You look happy.
Oh, I was happy. I think this area was just such a hidden gem and was very surprising in a lot of ways.
So here we are coming to the close of the first day. Again, the Monday before Labor Day. We've gone about 9 miles and we have seen no people at all, zero. And that was surprising to me. I thought we would encounter more people, but we did not. And of course, that's wonderful. Here we are at Goose Lake with some late season wildflowers, some pearly everlasting and Indian paintbrush. A little closer up view of those two fellows. We are sucker for wildflower photos, and the first day was the best day for them. After that, they were fading even more, and we were into different habitat types. We come up and out of the lake basin the next morning, and again, we're hit with this really interesting pitch. We're following this trail. It is eventually going to come up and around this side of the mountain and then down and over and up the ridge. So it's not a flat hike by any means, but it does go through this interesting area. If you look relatively closely at these trees, what you'll see is they're relatively uniform in height and growth patterns. This doesn't look like an area of recent burn and probably isn't recent, but very likely is one of those areas that burned over sometime between now and that century ago when the burns moved through. Due to its relatively uniform height, areas do regrow and areas do burn. And in this case, you're not walking through an area that's burned, despite the name, but you do get to see the effects of fire on the landscape and the effects of fire ecology. And if you have any background on that, this is a really interesting laboratory to see some areas that have recently burned, some areas that burned a long time ago, and some that haven't burned at all, some virgin timber stands. Always with finding the pinnacles that look for the trip ahead so we can see what's coming up. Because of the aspect and the soil type, and again, this is probably not burn patterns so much, but just the way that the landscape is formed, there are a lot in the northern third of this hike, a lot of areas of open just grasslands, which offer some really stunning views. This lake and several throughout literally had no name, so I've labeled them in my talks and when I post photos elsewhere, no name lake. I think I called this one for us, no name lake number 1. We'll get to a couple no name lakes either. And they looked really interesting, but with no discernible trails down to it. You could make your way down there. Of course, then you'd have to make your way back up or through some really difficult, challenging canyons. What again was interesting to me as an avid hiker is how many different side trips to go exploring in this area potentially there would be. You could make your own loop by connecting some of the side trails into some of the lakes that have those, coming up on the ridge, exploring others, and you could have a wonderful time in there and not duplicate another person's journey. Continuing on again, day 2, we continued to see no people, which was really amazing as we were traveling across the top of the ridge near some of the lake basins that did have trails. We kept expecting people to come up from some of the side trails. This is a relatively good aspect to see how the ridge line is the way to go, that coming off the ridge line and going anywhere else is going to involve even a lot more elevation gain and loss than what we were doing. Late summer, early fall colors are starting to come on. Some of the shrubs and bushes are starting to turn color. All of the huckleberries were gone last summer. If you live in our area, you'll remember it was a time when huckleberries ripened early or not at all. We were surprised from accounts past that we encountered no huckleberries in August, but that's the way they were. The berries are not always there. This is, to me, a particularly scenic area. We were overlooking on either side of the divide basins. This is a lake basin into the Idaho side, the lower steep lake basin. And we continued on above it. You can see clouds starting to set in, and we had known in the forecast that it was likely on Tuesday, day 2, we would have some passing rain. The forecast as of Sunday had that shower moving through in about an hour, not being particularly significant, but here we are mid-afternoon and the clouds are building. We're reaching one of the high points of the entire trip and the clouds are really building. We're continuing along a ridge with some scattered stands of trees. Again, no people, budding clouds, stunning topography. And really the best thing to do at this point was to go on. We hoped we'd get over the hump and make our way down into the Fish Lake Basin for our second night camp. We were moving so expeditiously that we delayed lunch till late afternoon, thinking we might have a quick snap and just keep going. This was the second of our no-name lakes. We called it No Name Wallow. It looked to me a lot like the elk wallows that we find up here in the Cabinet Mountains in North Idaho and northwestern Montana. The clouds are really building. You can see a lot of energy in them. And we knew about this time that we did not want to be on this long, open, exposed ridge where you can see lots of trees that had lightning strikes. So we opted to not continue on, as another half hour would have put us in about that vicinity of these large thunder cells moving in. So we backtracked a little, declined in elevation, so we'd be in a mixed stand of trees where fewer lightning strikes and better protection because you weren't out in the semi-open. We've had a fair number of incidents in Colorado and in the Sierras with dodging thunderstorms. And that afforded us the second view of Upper Steep Lake, backtracking the way we did. And here we started to descend to find a better hidey hole as the storm system really moved in. We ended up in that storm sitting there for over 3 hours. The system stalled and it dumped later on, we learned, around 1.5 inches of rain in Missoula. And for the next 3 days, we saw pockets of hail lining the trails, the same hail that fell on us. It was a really severe summer storm. It put us 3 hours behind, which meant it was going to be difficult to get to our destination at Fish Lake. So here we are later in the afternoon, eyeballing potential places to camp along the ridge line, running fairly low on water, but nursing enough to be able to survive the night. And from here, we could see down here in this gap some possibilities for camping. And then after that, there weren't going to be very many. So we refigured our plans as our destination being that gap where we would potentially have a reasonable spot to camp in and a reasonable hike out the next day with limited water supplies, but enough to last the night. Looking back over the Idaho side, again, you can see this area here of trees that were either probably the darkening colors, probably either from a large insect infestation, although it looked more like they had been an area with light to moderate ground level disturbance or burn that moved through and only burned very lightly, and at some point burned more heavily on these slopes. Again, a wonderful laboratory for looking at wildfire. So we pitched our camp in the saddle in a relatively rough spot as it was getting dark, with about 3 miles to go to Fish Lake. The other option being continuing on in another budding rainstorm and hiking in the night in rain just didn't seem very pleasant, and we weren't in that big a rush. We managed to collect unintentionally about 1.5 gallons of water in this pocket fold in the tent. Always consider how you pitch your tent to be able to collect water if you're in a really dry landscape. I will say that wasn't our main intent, but this tent allowed for that design, and it meant a couple of things. That water didn't have to run down below us, and we also had a reasonably good drinking water the next day, right, Deb?
Yeah, this was not a clinic in how to pitch a tent correctly, but that's what happens when it's dark and it's late and it's raining and you're hungry.
Yeah, we always have enough food on hand that we don't need to cook, that we can have a no cook meal, dive in the tent, get out of the rain, survive the night. So at this point, we are behind schedule by about 3 hours, but really one night we intended to be in Fish Lake. And, that was going to set us up really well for the leg we needed to do the next day, which was going to be the longest leg of our original idea to traverse the entirety of the Great Burn. The clouds lifted and some stunning views, Upper Siamese Lake. You can see just wonderful green basins. I think that's an alpine daisy, Deb, is that right?
I'm not sure. There's so many purple flowers that look very similar. It could be an aster as well.
Might be an aster, yes. So we got down to Fish Lake and made it down that morning about 9 o'clock. It had rained that whole morning, so I didn't get very many photos after the Siamese Lake because it was raining, and it was a really challenging 3 miles of trail. In retrospect, I'm very glad we didn't do it in the dark. As we moved through there were about 3 dozen down trees, and it was an area that had been untouched by fire. So many of them were old growth, a good couple feet in diameter, and were challenging enough to walk over in the light in light rain. So we got down to Fish Lake. This is the next day. We got down to Fish Lake hoping that we would be able to have a late breakfast, dry out. And instead, what we found was it was raining solidly Wednesday, and we weren't able to dry out. We just had to pitch the tent again to dive in it to get out of the rain. So this was the next morning, Thursday morning. Now we are fully a full day behind schedule, which on a long distance hike may or may not be a big deal, but on a short hike where you're planning between days off for work and travel time and cars and food, it is a bit more of a concern. But we had enough options. We thought that we'd be okay. One of them being just walk faster the next day. Coming up out of Fish Lake again, some wonderful forests of that mixed density, older, more well-established forests of what might be termed old growth or perhaps second growth, but they are approaching a second successional level of species. Nice mix. We also encountered coming out of Fish Lake for most of the rest of that day, another several dozen downed trees. It was an area that needed a lot of attention. I was taking some really pretty good notes, hoping to turn them over to Alex when I got done. Coming down off of the divide after Fish Lake through an area of somewhat recent burn, you can see the impact that has on the landscape, the explosion of undergrowth, the regeneration of some smaller trees. And one of my favorite spots of the entire trip that had some limited camping and a fairly difficult time getting into as any feeder trail. This was probably maximum distance from any side feeder trail that we found for lake basins along the route. It had no name, but it's at the upper head of the West Fork of Fish Creek. Very scenic spot that had we not been pressed for time, we could have spent at least a full day in lounging around and enjoying its environs. Climbing out of the Fish Creek No Name Lake, we hit a divide. Looking at the other side, this is the very upper end of the North Fork of Kelly Creek, one of Idaho's iconic trout fishing creeks. Many of my friends know the lower reaches of it very well. And the upper end is really interesting. We started to hear wolves howl on this day. We could hear them, at least two of them, down in that big valley. Lots of grouse. The flowering plant next to it, the small leaf plant is whortleberry. Some know it as grouse whortleberry. So I thought it was very propitious that we found grouse in the grouse whortleberry areas, although very few berries. So here we encountered the first human beings we had seen on day 4. We had gone 3.5 days without seeing anyone. And the two people we see are a crosscut saw crew out of the 9 Mile Ranger District working their way north, who wanted to know about the state of downed trees. And here I was with my notes, and I told them what they'd encounter over the next 2 days, 2.5 days, if they were moving at a hiker pace. And I counted it up, and it was about 6 dozen downed trees. They had arranged their work trip to finish up at Hough Pass, and so far as I know, they've been successful. So really glad to see them on the one hand, that now I didn't have to report back to Kelly to schedule a special project. On the other hand, I'd been wishing either they were a couple days earlier or we were a couple days later. Although that all said and done, may be part of what keeps people out of the area. The slide very similar to the cover slide. The area after we saw them, you come to another one of the high points near a place called Admiralty Peak, heavily timbered, so not a lot of great views, but coming off of Admiralty Peak, there's again stunning panoramas that you see as you come down the entire spine, and you can see lake basins off to the east and to the west, and this really area of heavily convoluted mountains, which was our eventual destination. That's where the trail stops and goes out at Schley. And then this would be some bushwhacking that looked just very intriguing. Another of the no-name lake wallows looking off to the east. And from just a little bit further on than the slide taken with myself in it, you could look off to the east, and in the far distance there, see the Mission Mountains, several ranges over. Missoula lies down in one of those valleys, and then just beyond Missoula, the Mission Mountains, probably as the air mile goes, I'm going to guess they're 60 miles away, roughly, maybe 50. But on a clear day, you can see the missions. Late afternoon, I stopped because I was getting a little bit of a hot spot on one of my heels, and so do a little foot repair before it gets too bad. And got up from that and tied the shoes and stretch and take a little bit of water and just walk over the edge and look down at Mud Lake. And what we saw when I did that, this is just a little off trail, was a really dark object moving right here, but it's so far away with the naked eye, you really couldn't make it out. With the 30 times zoom on the camera, you could begin to get images. And we watched the critter for about 35 to 40 minutes work its way around the lake. This is one of the more clear images. And at first we were perplexed as to what it would be. We ruled out some of the obvious things that we thought it could be, and we finally settled on it might be a wolverine or it might be someone from the canid family, but it didn't look like a wolf and act like a wolf. And we could hear wolves in the distance. And it also didn't seem particularly too concerned, though its ears did perk up. After sending some video and film to some biologist friends of mine, they determined that most likely it was a dark-phased red fox, which is also a fairly unusual animal. And there have been, I learned later from a friend at Wild Montana, who'd been up there a couple weeks after. She also saw a dark-phased red fox, not too far away, maybe 20 miles north. So they are in the area, and that was a really just a cool sighting, watching an animal in the wild as it's undisturbed by us for over half an hour as it's hunting small prey along the lake is, to me, a defining wilderness moment, and one that only happens when you get to backcountry where human disturbance is really minimal. So we continued to hike with our seeing no other people. We're approaching Labor Day weekend, and here we are dropping in on Friday to another hollow, a ridge, and then eventually to a place called Kidd Lake. Late in the day, we love that late in the day light. Again, mountains off to the south that we had originally planned to hike across, but we're now beginning to consider our options. And we get down to Kidd Lake. From there, we could bail out to Schley, a few miles to the west, but our car is at the very southern end, beyond where we had intended to go. And from here, we are very shortly going to leave the trail another mile after this and start our bushwhack along a pretty dry route. And we had originally planned to do that in three stops, 2 nights. And the trouble is trying to condense that into 2 days. One stop meant we would be running out of water or having to carry it to dry camp. Anyway, the solution seemed to be to add miles, but hike down Kelly Creek and back up, but be able to have water access close by so we carry less weight and be able to divide it up more evenly. So that's what we decided to do. We'd go down Kelly Creek and look for the feeder trail that comes back up to a place where you can catch trail to the car. Overnight, it turned cold. We had our rain and rain delays and our warm days. And now, as you can see from the way Deb's bundled up, it's the Saturday of Labor Day weekend, and it's turning cold. But the big, broad valley of Kelly Creek is very inviting. And we were excited to see it, heard so many things about it. As you can see, it's a little unsettled in terms of the weather, but we're heading down into it and having a good time because we figured, well, we can make those miles. It's 1 downhill, 1 uphill, cut it halfway, and we'll do 13 miles each day, and we'll be out to the car. So we get down, and actually about the last slide where we turned around, about here, and I don't have any good slides of the turnaround spot. We got down and we looked around and looked around and looked around, and the trail that supposedly existed on the map that would come up out of that and go back to the southern end of the mountains just didn't exist on the ground. We determined after 2 hours of looking that it was either so overgrown or had been abandoned and not maintained, and all signage taken out, that it would be unwise to go further looking for it and be struggling off trail trying to ford Kelly Creek and enter into a greater degree of uncertainty. It also wouldn't make sense to continue down the trail going west along Kelly Creek, as we didn't have great maps of that, and we knew that that road end was about 70 miles from the nearest town with probably no visitation. We had at that point only seen 2 other people, a horse packer doing some maintenance on the Kelly Creek Trail that we're heading up. So we camped and we made the decision to hike back up to Kidd Lake and then out the next day. With very uncertain prospects of being able to hitchhike out of the road at Schley Saddle. But that plan being better, in the worst case, we got to the Schley Saddle Road and couldn't catch a ride. It was only another 12 miles down to the main road, and there we'd certainly be able to get something. And we'd only be a day late, which would work. There's water sources along it. We had enough food, and we had it a day at the end of it to stay at home before going back to work. So a day late wouldn't be too disruptive. And that's what we did. We came back up, had lunch at Kidd Lake again, hiked up out over stunning views of the Kelly Creek Valley, views of what would have been our trip ahead along the bushwhacking along this ridge line, and said, there's more unfinished business we're going to have to come back and do. Although this one I'm having a harder time convincing Deb of doing, but I do want to come back and do the bushwhack along some of the southern end of those mountains. It would be truly wild country. Just looking at it, to me, is very inviting. So this is Slate Peak, which was going to be the major peak we climbed over or decided to go around. And there's both options seemed very good, and both options would be interesting to try at some point in the future. One more. Yep. Here we are coming out the trail to the Schley Saddle area. Again, a very lightly used area in general, and even Labor Day weekend coming out that day, that Sunday, all we saw were one fly fisherman and 2 hunters that were coming in early season. We got to the trailhead and there were 4 cars. 2 of them we know were in, and 2 others we didn't know anything about. The 5th one for the Forest Service crew. And we started our hitch out late in the day with very uncertain prospects, but lo and behold, 15 minutes later, we got a ride out to the main road from the 1 car that was there. We waited along the main road while they went the other direction for an hour, and the 2nd car came out and took us all the way to Missoula. So from there, we could get a ride from a friend back up to the Hoodoo trailhead the next day, and all was well. So it was a true adventure. And I would close it by saying, of the many miles Deb and I have walked, for those who know us, and if you don't, a brief bit about our background as long distance hikers. We've hiked the length of the Appalachian Trail, the Continental Divide, the Pacific Crest Trail. We live in North Idaho in part because the wildlands we have around here in North Idaho, northwestern Montana, are some of the wildest we've seen anywhere. And in my day job, I advocate for wilderness protection for the Scotchman Peaks, which I often describe as one of the wildest places that exists in the lower 48. And the Great Burn here as a destination has very much that same character, and has a more extensive, because of its size, system of hiking trails. To me, I would put the 30 odd miles of the Stateline Trail that we did right up there with 30 miles of any of the best of the national scenic trails we've seen. Wouldn't you, Deb?
I would. And one of my criteria for hiking is that I don't like to see a lot of other people, which I know is rather selfish. But this was a very good trip for solitude, if that's what you're seeking.
Mm-hmm. Great area for solitude. I think the Stateline Trail, to me, is probably the best way to go after it. If you can arrange the car shuttle from the Schley Saddle to Hoodoo or vice versa, that 30 miles would make a wonderful 3-day trip. You could do it in a weekend if you figure out the travel, depending how close you are. I put up this because the best maps here are the Great Burn Outdoor Recreation Map. This is available online or in stores throughout the region. And the map of the proposed Great Burn that's published by the Great Burn Conservation Alliance, which does an outstanding job of maintaining trail access to the area, doing weed monitoring. They've worked with ITA on a couple of projects in the area. They do great work advocating for the long-term protection of the resource, and deserve a look if you have a chance to go online and look at the Great Burn Conservation Association Alliance, rather, easy to Google and find. I think that's about it for the formal remarks I've got. I'm really happy to take questions. I always like to leave plenty of room for questions, so I hope there are some.
Yeah. So I actually have some questions. I'll start off. So one, you just kind of were mentioning it. Did you guys set up a shuttle? Like, how did you set up your shuttle for where
Mm,
your
Great,
cars?
great question. So we didn't delve too much into talking to our original plan because it went astray. But our original plan to hike from the north end to the south end meant we had to leave cars at both. And the north end's relatively easy to get to. Out of Superior, you drive about 20 to 30 miles up the road to Hoodoo Pass. It's a high-speed gravel road. It's a major access point to get into the drainages on the west side of the upper Clearwater Basin area. Fly fishers use it a lot. And so, and a lot of great potential trails or actual trails that are potential destinations along the way. It's a long way around, though, to come back down to Superior, drive through Missoula, down to Lolo Pass, up and over Lolo Pass to get to the southern end. And once you've gotten to Lolo Pass, your fun has just begun. Where we decided to leave the car, the southwestern toe is Cayuse Creek. To get to Cayuse Creek, it's only about 15, 16 miles off of the main highway, but it is such slow going. The roads are so degraded. Part of it is the Lolo Highway, so-called Lolo Highway, Lolo Traverse Road 500, that was literally used by the Lewis and Clark expedition. And as I've joked with friends since, I think hasn't seen any maintenance since they went through. Average speed for us was less than 10 miles an hour on it. It took 2 hours from leaving the highway to get into the end. So we left our car there, and just the act of leaving a car north or driving around to the south, leaving a car there and driving back north adds a full day. And then on the other end, having to do that adds a full day. So if you're going to do that entire traverse, you're going to have 2 full days of driving just from the time you've gotten to Missoula. That's why I think for someone doing a shorter trip who isn't into it for the wild adventure, leaving a car at Schley would be easier. It's not as far a drive around. It's off of Fish Creek Road. It's still some driving. You'd need to arrange a car shuttle, self-supported shuttle. I don't know of any services doing that. But in the end, you could potentially hitchhike in and out of those two. The southern terminus there, we were the only car when we went in, the only car when we went out. Being Labor Day weekend coming out, we saw a few motorcycles and other vehicles doing a little bit of traversing, but very, very few. It's not a heavily trafficked area.
So just out of curiosity, do you have an idea of how many miles it is from trail miles from Schley Pass to the southern terminus?
Well, trail miles, as you come from Schley into Kidd Lake, that's only about 3, maybe 4 miles. And about halfway in or less, about a mile and a half in, you hit the ridge line. And from the ridge line, then it's a bushwhack. I'm told that first part of that bushwhack to a place called Humm Lake is really old trail that's no longer on the maps and no longer worked, and it's in pretty good condition. So it's not too bad for off-trail hiking. It's really an old trail. You just have to know how to find it. Then from Humm Lake back up to the divide and probably hiking around Shale Peak, it's about 7 or 8 miles to a trail that's a manway that isn't well maintained to some upper lakes on the east side of the main peaks. And then from there, you can catch some trails that come down into Cayuse. I, about 2, 3 years ago, hiked in from that a couple miles just to see how they were. And they were a lot of down trees. They weren't well maintained because they aren't well maintained. They're well off the beaten path. They're a low priority for maintenance. But there are trails there you can see on the ground. You just have to allow for a little extra time to go a bit more slow. In all total, the mileage you'd end up walking is probably close to 20.
Oh,
I think
okay.
our original vision was about 50, 55 miles.
Gotcha. Okay, just curious.
Yeah.
Sounds like it'd be a good opportunity to get some people to do like a key swap halfway between or something.
Yeah, if you felt very confident you could make it, that you weren't
Yeah.
going to get caught in the rain, lost in the brush, run out of water, any of those things. That's the problem with key swaps. And I will say this area is so rugged that that venture would have some risk involved too.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah. Chris Baldini, you and I have the same next question. So as you were talking about this, I had Gaia pulled up and I was following on my map what you were talking about, and um water sources, were they
yes,
pretty convenient for
there are very few water sources along the ridge line. You have to drop into the basins, into the lake basins to get to them. And that's why we chose the campsites we did. The first campsite at Goose Lake, we get water from. And on that first day, otherwise, there was no water. Then the next day to Fish Lake, there's no water till you get to Fish Lake. Then from there, you've got the No Name Lake we dropped into and Kid Lake. So another way to go at the traverse, which would be more certain in terms of trail, would be to not end at Cayuse Creek, but end down at Kelly Creek. And there, coming down Kelly Creek is a really strong trail, used a lot by hunters, and so the horse traffic in there has kept the trail open. And so that you wouldn't have to worry about the exchange of keys so much. But that route out would be a lower elevation route, and I loved Kelly Creek. It wouldn't have that high elevation, stay on the divide, traverse it from north to south aspect. And then fun has just started when you get to the end at the west side of Kelly Creek. It's a pretty long drive around. You'd still need a car and a car shuttle, and allow the time to come out the west end.
And let's see, Nick asks, so how about that umbrella I saw? Not a device I've ever used in rain.
I love umbrellas in the rain. I want Deb to chime in here too, but when we are doing our long distance hike in the long distance hiking communities, many people have adopted umbrellas. They're wonderful for sunshade in Southern California deserts in New Mexico. As long as the breeze isn't real heavy, they're nice in a rain, because for me, if I'm wearing a rain jacket and it's so-called waterproof, I sweat so much inside a waterproof rain jacket that I might as well not be wearing it. And so over time, I've taken to just keeping my rain jacket in my backpack and using it around camp to stay dry, and I will just get wet. The umbrella keeps you from getting wet. It keeps rain off your face, off your chest. So if you do wear a jacket, you can unzip it almost completely, and then it breathes a lot better. I'm a strong advocate of the umbrella. You can buy lightweight backpacking umbrellas. Six Moon Designs has a couple of models for sale that only weigh ounces, and to me, they're a wonderful addition to your backpacking arsenal. Deb was harder to convince in the early days, but I think you're a convert, Deb.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially hiking in the desert, in places where it was the only shade we had. It was great.
Yeah.
Really great. Chris says, how much weight did you each carry? Your packs look huge.
They look big because we carry some fairly bulky things. Not a terribly. We are not ultra lightweight hikers. We are somewhat lightweight hikers. Our base gear without luxuries, we can strip down to about 17, 18 pounds. But we were carrying a substantial amount of water. Again, knowing you're going to need to carry water all day, so we have packs that carry a fair amount of bulk. And we like our food, especially on the shorter trips. So we're carrying a fair amount of whole foods. So they do look a bit heavier. I have sleep apnea, so I carry CPAP equipment, and a portable CPAP with batteries and carrying case is 5 pounds of stuff. And so as we share gear, it takes a little extra weight. So we have to allow for the space and weight of the extra medical equipment. And while that isn't pleasant, it is what needs to be done. And so we do carry a bit more because of that.
Well, does anybody else have any other questions? Feel free to drop those in the chat. I thought this was really awesome. It's definitely making me kind of Jones to be out hiking somewhere. So this is great for an early spring presentation. And Phil, if you ever need a partner, let me know. That country looks cool.
I will let you know. It is a fabulous area and highly recommend it. And yeah, we will go back, Deb.
Absolutely.
Let's see, we have another question here. Connor Hall says, where did you say the southern access point to your start was? How did you get there?
Yeah, so we started in the north, and we were going to originally come out at a place called Cayuse, Cayuse, Cayuse Creek on the south end, which if you Google it, Cayuse Creek's a big creek and has a number of different access points. This one's the one that's closest to Cayuse Junction, just off the Route 500 so-called Lolo motorway. But we didn't make it there. What we did was we ended up coming out at a place called Schley Saddle. I'm looking at my map to get the spelling right. It's Schley, Schley Saddle. And if you Google that, you'll see the access road, the Forest Service road coming off of Fish Creek. That's a rough road. I would say it is high suspension, if not four-wheel drive only. We sat in the back of a pickup truck bouncing down along it, still only at about 10 miles an hour. And but it's well traveled enough, better than the other, that it's a little less daunting, I'd say. The northern access was at a place called Hough Pass. Again, much easier to get into and out of.
Yeah, and I was just looking at the map here, and it looks like if you stay on the Stateline Trail going south, you'll come out at like Granite Pass, which there's a road that goes to Lolo Pass.
Well,
I mean, is that?
no, that's not the Stateline Trail. If you stay, the Stateline Trail comes out at Schley. That's Trail 738. If you at Kid Lake take the other route, which is 567, that comes out at Kelly Creek. To get to Granite Pass, you've got to do some bushwhacking there, or you come down to Kelly Creek and you have more success than we did at finding 513, which I will shorthand this for you. I've talked to the Forest Service since then, and they basically have abandoned it as a trail. They're no longer continuing to maintain it. They rerouted its access some years ago, and they don't maintain that either. So that's not a viable option. So the only way to come down to Granite is to do some measure of bushwhacking, the most likely route being the one up around Shale Mountain. And looking at that, it looks doable on the map, and I've read a couple of accounts of people who have hiked it from the south side, but I personally would probably bushwhack around to the basins that are on the east side of it because of the fact they're less exposed. And Deb doesn't like climbing that high rock. But then you do have the option of coming out if you wanted around to the east, Pilot Knob and Granite Pass. But I'm told that involves about 15 miles of ridge walking there that's waterless. So there you're going to have a long carry for water or coming off of it on one side or the other into the streams. So in all, it's dependent in part on water there. But that is a potential route if you wanted to stay high on the divide, and one that has some merit and involves a little less bushwhacking, but still some bushwhacking. And when I say bushwhacking, I mean sort of generic. A lot of that would be the boulder hopping type of bushwhacking. So off trail with some good knowledge of how to hike off trail, as well as navigational abilities required, of course. Say something else that, oh yeah, in the process of putting all this together and just talking to people who have hiked in different parts of it all, including the last two people who've done field seasons for the Great Burn Conservation Alliance, this is a trip that in many years snow is going to make impossible until well into July. Now this year may be an exception to that, but consider the snowpack, particularly at the southern end on those bushwhacking routes, and you're probably not going to want to do this except for the months of July and August, maybe September if rainings haven't set in yet.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Okay, yeah, and just a couple of kudos here. Thanks for the presentation. Rory says, I am in awe. Apologies if I mispronounced your name. Toivo says, going south from Kid Lake to the upper reaches of Kelly Creek and hiking down gets you down to Moose Creek on a highly popular fishing area of Kelly Creek. Easy to get a ride back up to Hough Pass from there.
Yeah, if you're do it at a time when there's people there. I'm told that you go farther down Kelly Creek, it's a lot of fisher people, and their main access is in and out of Hoodoo Pass, which would be another option, driving in that way and dropping a car or trusting you'll get a ride out.
Very cool.
I
Well,
will
thank
say
you
that,
so much. Or go ahead.
oh yeah, the last thing is the ICT goes through parts of this area. There's a couple of different routes that it takes, and convergent with the Stateline Trail from Fish Lake north to Hoodoo Pass. So that two different options of the ICT converge at Fish Lake, and then from there they go north along the Stateline Trail to Hoodoo Pass, and then continue on north. So that section of the trail from Fish Lake to Hoodoo Pass does see more traffic from Idaho Centennial Trail hikers, perhaps some more attention from the Forest Service for both management as well as trail clearing. And is the one part of the trail that we have friends who go, oh yeah, I know that. I've seen that part. So, yeah.
Okay, well, thanks so much, Deb and Phil. That was really awesome to just get an adventure through your eyes. Thank you to all the people who showed up tonight. It will be recorded and it will probably land out on our YouTube channel. So you can check out this presentation and past presentations out there. And again, just to stay informed with what's going on with ITA, you can check out our Facebook page. If you're not into Facebook, you can also sign up for our newsletter at idahotrailsassociation.org. And with that, say good night. Thanks for coming.